Okay, so this example here has a few purposes. So one is to simply understand a little bit better this idea of value added. So we talked about GDP and ways we could calculate it, and one way that we just finished in the previous video is to look at the value added at each step in the production process. Now, if we look at kind of reality, how things work, a smartphone is a great example. The production process for a lot of goods that we purchase is fairly complicated and involves goods and services from a lot of different parts of the world. So, how exactly does that work? So, here's an example of producing a smartphone in a fair amount of detail, and I thought we could go through it and try to calculate what is the total contribution to GDP as a result of this smartphone. So we see down here at the end that smartphone producers or retailers have sold a total of $30 billion in smartphones. So we're tempted to say, well, that's the final good or service, so shouldn't that be the contribution to GDP? Well, we'll go with value added here and see what we come up with. And there's an important idea here, which are exports and imports, which we'll talk more about in the next video. So we start at the beginning of the process up here. And a rare minerals broker in China buys $15 billion worth of minerals, including $5 million of minerals from U.S. mines. So the mineral is going to be part of what goes into producing, let's say, the camera or the screen for the smartphone. So what in this would count towards U.S. GDP? Well, remember, GDP is the market value of final goods and services produced in a country at a given period of time. So what we see here is that from the U.S. GDP perspective, there's $5 million of value added. This was a good, minerals, that was produced in the U.S. Now, it was sold to someone in China, but it is still something produced in the U.S. So we've got $5 million that has been produced in the U.S. Okay, now for the next several steps of the production process here, there's no U.S. production that's taking place. All right, so we have a microchip producer in Japan, buys some of these minerals for $10 billion, and another camera and screen producer in South Korea buys the other half for $10 million. Manufacturing factory in China takes the microchips, cameras, and screens for $22 billion, buys those, and it buys a bunch of other materials for $3 billion. Okay, so this is all just information at this point, right? When I look at the countries, none of that is production that took place in the U.S. I've already accounted for that with the $5 million. Now, in the next step here, we're finally back to the U.S. So a US-based smartphone company, let's say Apple, pays the factory in China $28 billion for the phones that are put together. So it takes the raw hardware and it puts its software on there and goes from there, right? It then is going to keep $10 billion worth of smartphones in inventory and sells the rest to retailers for $25 billion. So notice the total amount here that's produced is $35 billion. Okay, so is that all value added? The answer is no. Only $7 billion of that was value added. Because they bought the smartphones from the factory for $28 billion, right? So they added $7 billion in value. Okay, so we've got $5 million from the, sorry, it should be billion up here. I'm going to call this billion, typo. $5 billion from U.S. mines, plus $7 billion from the smartphone company. And then we have retailers selling these phones in the US for a total of $30 billion in revenue. Well, if we add that up, so they've got 30 billion in total revenue, but what were their inputs to that production process? And it was 25 billion is what they paid for it. So 30 billion in revenue minus the 25 billion that they bought it for from the software company there. And so in terms of total value added, they've added 5 billion. So now I've determined at every step here what is value added in the US production that took place. The answer is 5 billion plus 7 billion plus 5 billion. So the total contribution to US GDP is $17 billion. 5 billion for the minerals, 7 billion from the smartphone company. Oh, sorry, can't see that. 7 billion for the smartphone company, and then 5 billion from the retailers. Gives me to 17 billion. So that's still the same value-added idea. It's just a little bit more complex because we have lots of different countries involved. And so the key is to focus specifically on where the production takes place and only count production that takes place in the US. From there, I still have to use the value-added idea. Take their total revenue minus the cost of any intermediate goods, and that is their value added. So I like this example because it reminds us how GDP is operating and gives us an idea of what exactly it tells us, and it kind of gives us some insight into the complicated production process for goods and services that we buy here in the US. So we'll talk more about this issue of goods produced in other countries in our next video.